Good day, everyone! Let us prepare ourselves as we will study and learn the Bible of psychologists, which is the DSM. I am Jala Abrique, and at the end of our discussion, we will be able to identify and explain neurodevelopmental disorders, particularly the intellectual developmental disorder, communication disorders, autism spectrum disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But before we will dig deeper in the disorders, let us have first a brief discussion about the DSM. And on my PPT po, words highlighted with green color are additional informations sa DSM-5-TRs. Yun po yung mga informations na wala po sa DSM-5. While mga informations highlighted with mint green color are informations na nandun na po sa DSM-5 pero gi-elaborate or gi-revise po siya doon. So yun po yung mga texts sa DSM-5-TR na gi-revise. So, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, also known as the DSM, of the American Psychiatric Association, is a classification of mental disorders with associated criteria designed to facilitate more reliable diagnosis of these disorders. So, DSM is a medical classification of disorders and as such serves as a historically determined cognitive schema imposed on clinical and scientific information to increase its comprehensibility and utility. So, DSM has successive editions over the past 60 years. And mental disorders do not always fit completely within the boundaries of a single disorder. So, yung mental disorders, I know, alam naman natin yan lahat. So, hindi ko na elaborate yan siya. The diagnosis of a mental disorder is not equivalent to a need for therapy. Kasi nga po, pag sinabi natin na need for treatment, ito po ay komplikado that takes into consideration ang symptom severity, symptom salience, kung mas na ba, distress, yung mental pain associated with the symptoms, disability related to the symptom, risk and benefits of available treatment, and other factors. Meron din namang hindi nila nami-meet yung full criteria ng isang disorder, pero nag-demonstrate na kailangan na di nila ng treatment or care at hindi sila dapat pagkaitan nun. It should be noted that the definition of mental disorder was developed for clinical, public health, and research purposes and even in legal judgment. So DSM, ang standard reference ng clinical practice sa mental health field. The classification of disorders is harmonized with the World Health Organization's International Classification of Diseases or ICD. So before each disorder name, ICD-10-CM codes are provided. So pag black lines, it indicates that the ICD-10-CM code depends on the applicable subtype, specifier, or class of the substance. And following chapter titles and disorder names. So page numbers for the corresponding text or criteria are also included in the parentheses. So for your mental disorders due to another medical condition, insert the name of the etiological medical condition within the name of the mental disorder due to the medical condition. So the code and name of the etiological medical condition should be listed first immediately before the mental disorder due to the medical condition. Let us also have a brief summary of the history of the DSM-5-TR. So the first edition of this DSM or the DSM-1 appeared first in 1952. So they used the term reaction throughout the classification reflected the influence of Adolf Meyer's psychobiological view that mental disorders represented reactions of the personality to psychological, social, and biological factors in DSM. Yung DSM-2 naman po is based on ICD-8. Both the DSM-2 and ICD-8 went into effect in 1968. The DSM-3 is based on ICD-9. Moreover, the inconsistencies in the system of DSM-3 led to DSM-3R in 1987. Yung DSM-4 naman po was published in 1994. That was a culmination of a 6-year effort that involved more than 1,000 individuals and numerous professional organizations. So ICD-10 was published in 1992. Through the efforts resulted increased congruence in the two systems, the DSM-4 and ICD-10. So yung DSM-4TR naman was published in 2000 and the DSM-5 was published in 2013. And yung DSM-5 is multi-action na siya. And the DSM-5TR was published in this year, 2022. So, DSM contains sections and they are the following. So, first is the recording procedures. Kung paano natin, itong recording procedures ay nag-provide ng guidelines kung paano natin i-report ang name ng disorder and para sa pagpili ng mga recording that is appropriate ICD-10-CM diagnostic code. So it also includes instructions for applying and appropriate subtypes and or the specifiers. So next are the subtypes or specifiers. So the subtype and specifiers provides brief description of applicable subtype or the specifier. Next are the diagnostic features. So these diagnostic features provides a descriptive text illustrating the use of the criteria and includes key points on their interpretation. While the associated features naman, ito yung mga included sa clinical features that are not represented in the diagnostic criteria but occur significantly more often in individuals na merong disorder than those without the disorder. Prevalence na describe ng rate ng disorder sa isang community, most often it is described as a 12-month prevalence. Although for some disorders, point of prevalence is noted. So prevalence estimates are also provided by age group, by ethno-racial cultural group, and also by sex ratio. So yung development ng course naman nag-describe sa lifetime patterns of presentation and evolution of the disorder. Yung risk and prognosis factors naman, ito yung mga factors na nag-contribute sa development ng disorder. Yung culture-related diagnostic issues, nag-address sa culture, sa isang mental disorder, yung sex and gender-related diagnostic issues, nag-correlate sa diagnosis na related sa sex or gender. Yung diagnostic markers naman addresses the objective measures that have established diagnostic value. Yung association with suicidal thoughts naman or behavior provides information about the disorder-specific prevalence of suicidal thoughts or behavior, as well as risk factors for suicide that may be associated with the disorder. Yung functional consequences, syempre, mga consequences sa pag-function ng isang tao na meron ng disorder. Yung differential diagnosis naman, nag-differentiate ng disorder sa iba pang disorder na medyo may similar presenting characteristics. Yung comorbidity naman nag-describe ng mental disorder. It includes descriptions of mental disorders and other medical conditions likely to co-occur with the diagnosis. We will now be learning about the neurodevelopmental disorders. Ito ay mga disorders na nagsisimula sa developmental period. Kasi nga, neurodevelopmental, it means that it is characterized by developmental deficits or differences sa brain processes na nagpapahina sa personal, social, academic, at occupational functioning. It ranges from very specific limitations of learning or control of executive functions to global impairments. So the diagnosis of this disorder requires the presence of both the symptoms and impaired functioning. Neurodevelopmental disorders co-occur with one another with mental and behavioral disorders. So, neurodevelopmental disorders includes intellectual development disorders, communication disorders, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, specific learning disorder, motor disorder, tic disorders, and other neurodevelopmental disorders. But my coverage will only be the intellectual development disorders that includes intellectual development disorder or intellectual disability, the F88 or the global development delay, the F79, the unspecified intellectual development disorder. And also, my coverage will be communication disorders, the F80.2, the language disorder, F80.0, speech Sound disorder, F80.81. Childhood onset fluency disorder, F80.82. Social pragmatic communication disorder, F80.9. And specified communication disorder. Also, autism spectrum disorder that includes F84.0 or the autism spectrum disorder itself. So next is I will also discuss the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That includes attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The F90.8 or the other specified attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and the F90.9 or the unspecified attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So first, let us discuss the intellectual development disorders, and in the DSM-5, it was called intellectual disabilities. And first, online, we have the intellectual development disorder or intellectual disability. And the diagnostic criteria for this is first, okay, so the onset is during the developmental period that includes both intellectual and adaptive functioning deficits in conceptual, social, and practical domains. So the following three criteria must be met. So first, deficits in intellectual functions such as reasoning, problem solving, planning, abstract thinking, judgment, academic learning, and learning from experience, confirmed by both clinical assessments and individualized standardized intelligence testing. So for its features, for the criterion A, it includes deficits in general mental abilities. So critical components include verbal comprehension, working memory, perceptual reasoning, quantitative reasoning, abstract thought, and cognitive efficacy. So intellectual functioning is typically measured with individually administered psychometrically valid, comprehensive, and culturally appropriate tests of intelligence. For the criteria B, deficits in adaptive functioning that results in failure to meet the developmental and sociocultural standards for personal independence and social responsibility. So without ongoing support, the adaptive deficits limit functioning in one or more activities of daily life, such as communication, social participation, independent living across multiple environments such as home, school, work, and community. So its features, it includes impairment in everyday adaptive functioning individuals' age, gender, and social culturally matched peers. So deficits in adaptive functioning refer to how well a person meets community standards of personal independence and social responsibility in comparison to others of similar age and social cultural background. Adaptive functioning involves adaptive reasoning in three domains. So what are those domains? So we have the conceptual. For the conceptual or the academic, it involves competence in memory, language, reading, writing, math, reasoning, acquisition of practical knowledge, problem solving, and judgment in novel situations, among others. For the social domain, it involves awareness of others' thoughts, feelings, and experiences, empathy, interpersonal communication skills, friendship abilities, social judgment, among others. For the practical domain, it involves learning and self-management across life settings, including personal care, job responsibilities, money management, recreation, self-management of behavior, school and work task organization, among others. Intellectual capacity, education, motivation, socialization, personality features, vocational opportunity, cultural experience, and coexisting other medical conditions or mental disorders influence adaptive functioning. So criterion B is met when at least one domain of adaptive functioning, which are the conceptual, social, or practical, is sufficiently impaired that ongoing support is needed in order for the person to perform adequately across multiple environments such as home, school, work, and community. So for the criterion C, we have the onset of intellectual and adaptive deficits during the developmental period. So criterion C is of the onset during the developmental period refers to recognition that intellectual and adaptive deficits are present during childhood or adolescence. So note that the term intellectual development disorder is used to clarify its relationship with the WHO's ICD-11 classification system, which uses the term disorders of intellectual development. The equivalent term intellectual disability is placed in parentheses for continued use. The medical and research literature use both terms, while intellectual disability is a term in common use by educational and other professions, advocacy groups, and the lay public. So, ang severity nito ay pwedeng mild, moderate, severe, o profound. So, kaya wala siyang number before it because yung sinabi ko na kanina na it is characterized, nakadepende sa subtype or specifier. So, dito, it is from F70 to F73. Ang levels of severity nito ay defined based sa adaptive functioning dahil ang adaptive function ay nag-determine ng level ng support na kailangan ng isang bata. So the various level of severity are defined on the basis of adaptive functioning. So the adaptive functioning determines the level of supports required. For the severity level, we have the mild or the F70. The moderate or the F71, the severe F72, and the profound or F73. For the associated features, intellectual developmental disorder is a heterogeneous condition with multiple causes. So it includes associated difficulties with social judgment, assessment of risk that leads to increased accident and injury rates and exploitation by others. Also self-management of behavior, emotions, or interpersonal relationships, or motivation in school or work environments. And also individuals become distressed. So this word distressed is added above their intellectual limitations but cannot be seen as having an impact on functioning. For the prevalence, so in DSM-5, general population prevalence is approximately 1% and prevalence rates vary by age. Prevalence for severe intellectual disability is approximately 6 per 1,000. But in DSM-5-TR, sabi ng prevalence, overall general population prevalence is approximately 10 per 1,000. Middle income countries, approximately 16 per 1,000, and higher income countries, the global prevalence varies by country and level of development. So it is higher in youths than in adults. And in the United States, prevalence per 1,000 population does not vary significantly by ethno-racial groups. For the development and course, age and characteristic features at onset depend sa etiology, sa cause and severity of the brain dysfunction. So sa first 2 years, merong identifiable na delayed motor, language, and social milestones. So if associated sa genetic syndrome, meron itong characteristics of physical appearance. Ang ibang syndromes ay mayroon ding behavioral phenotype, which refers to specific behaviors na karakteristik ng isang particular na genetic disorder. In acquired forms, the onset may be abrupt following an illness. So this disorder is non-progressive, but it is lifelong and severity may change over time. For the risk and prognosis factors, meron siyang risk and prognosis factors sa genetic and physiological so it means na yung prenatal, perinatal, and postnatal ay nakaka-apekto o nagiging cause din ng disorder na to. So for the culture-related diagnostic issues, intellectual developmental disorder occurs across ethno-racial groups. So in DSM-5, itong ethno-racial groups is nakalagay doon, all races and cultures. So, cultural sensitivity and knowledge of socio-cultural conditions are needed during assessment. And cultural explanations for intellectual developmental disorder vary and may include cultural beliefs. For the sex and gender-related diagnostic issues naman, so sa DSM-5, itong section na to, is only gender-related diagnostic issues. Pero ito sa DSM-5-TR, meron siyang sex. So overall, males are more likely than females to be diagnosed with both mild and severe forms of intellectual disorder. However, itong mga sex ratios ay nag-vary widely in reported study. So, association with societal thoughts or behavior. So, this section is not included in DSM-5. Rather, it is found in the associated features supporting diagnosis. Excuse me. So, yung mga tao may IDD or intellectual developmental disorder can be at risk for suicide associated with comorbid mental disorder, higher intellectual and adaptive function, and immediate past stressors. So, for differential diagnosis, the diagnosis of intellectual developmental disorder should be made whenever criteria A, B, and C are met. If my genetic syndrome nagnaling sa IDD or intellectual developmental disorder, it should be noted as a concurrent diagnosis. So for the major neurocognitive disorder, it includes loss of cognitive functioning. So if major neurocognitive disorder occurs, both diagnoses of disorders may be given. Also, both neurocognitive disorder and intellectual developmental disorder diagnosis can be used if diagnostic criteria are met for intellectual developmental disorder. So, for the communication disorders and specific learning disorders, so these disorders are specific to communication and learning. So, yung yung major neurocognitive disorders, specific siya sa loss of cognitive functioning. Ito naman communication disorders and specific learning disorder, specific sa communication and learning. So, these disorders may co-occur. And if full criteria are met for both of the two disorders, both diagnoses are made. For the autism spectrum disorder naman, intellectual developmental disorder is common among individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Excuse me. For the comorbidity, neurodevelopmental and other mental and medical conditions are frequent in intellectual developmental disorder, with rates of some conditions 3 to 4 times higher than in the general population. So the most common occurring neurodevelopmental and other mental disorders are attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depressive and bipolar disorders, anxiety disorder, autism spectrum disorder, stereotypic movement disorder, impulse control disorders, and major neurocognitive disorder. So, knowledgeable informants are essential for identifying symptoms such as irritability, mood dysregulation, aggression, eating problems, sleep problems, and for assessing adaptive functioning in various community settings. So, individuals with intellectual developmental disorder disproportionately have more health problems, including obesity, than the general population. And frequently, they cannot verbalize physical symptoms they are experiencing that leads for them to have health problems being undiagnosed and untreated. So, under the intellectual developmental disorders, we also have the global developmental delay. So, this diagnosis, is reserved for individuals under the age of 5 years, when the clinical severity level cannot be reliably assessed during early childhood. So, this category is diagnosed when an individual fails to meet expected developmental milestones in several areas of intellectual functioning, and applies to individuals who are unable to undergo systematic assessments of intellectual functioning, including children who are too young to participate in standardized testing. So this category requires reassessment after a period of time. We also have unspecified intellectual developmental disorder. So ito naman is reserved for individuals over the age of 5 years, when assessment of the degree of intellectual developmental disorder by means of locally available procedures is rendered difficult or impossible because of associated sensory or physical impairments, as in blindness or bilingual deafness, locomotor disability, or presence of severe problem behaviors or co-occurring mental disorder. So this category should only be used in exceptional circumstances and requires reassessment after a period of time.